Oh yeah, being recorded does not make life.
Yeah, then it keeps crashing halfway.
Okay, that's fine.
Right, welcome everyone to this round. We all know the drill it is. I'm going to give you my name is Tal, and WUDC. Yeah. So without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to start.
We think it's problematic from inside government when foreign filmmakers who are profit-seeking and who have the incentive to to sensationalize certain issues that exist within other nations that create setback for certain movements happening, progressive movements happening within that nation. I think these are instances where it becomes problematic. When we have BBC creating India's Daughter, which was a complete misrepresentation of the Indian population and showed them to be a nation of rapists or a nation willing to have rape happening in their nation. I think those are instances where we think it becomes problematic and where we think we need a lot more check and balance happening within society. So what is a model from our side of the house? We will require collaboration of foreign filmmakers with multiple local production teams that exist within that country that they're going into, and these production teams will have to be actively involved in the production of the creation of that documentary whole from the start to the finish. So it's not just going to be people they interview, it's not just going to be people they talk to, but actual production teams that are going to actually have a say. The end goal of this is to have a documentary that portrays more than one local view and have a full representation of the views that exist within that nation, within that country, right? And we think that laws are made with certain aims in the first place, and the aim of the law that we would like to require from our side of the house is to be representative of the multiple views that exist within that nation and not to have stereotypes and stigmatization happening. We think that this is the best check and balance that we can achieve from our side of the house, and when that aim of the law in itself is broken by these foreign filmmakers, then they can be brought to court and we will be willing to punish them if that aim is not met. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of things. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about how foreign documentaries set the global narrative regarding that nation and issues existing in that nation, and how it's important to have that nation in itself take part in that conversation. And also, I'm going to be talking about the problems of those misrepresentations from two levels. Firstly, on an international area, on an international scale, and secondly, on the local scale, and how it affects the people existing within that country. So firstly, about the foreign documentaries and how it sets the global narratives. We need to recognize the fact that these filmmaking industries exist in an area and come from an area where they have a global platform to begin with, right? They are mainly based in Hollywood or in the Western nations where they already have a lot of money, and these are nations who have audiences already, audiences who are waiting and willing to watch the sufferings or the human drama just purely for the entertainment in the first place. So I think this is completely different from the local market who also can produce these films, can produce documentaries, but do not necessarily have that global platform to send their media out into public, or don't necessarily have the real demand or the real audience in comparison to these global platforms, right? Therefore, we think it's problematic when these global platforms and these filmmaking industries on a global scale take advantage of issues that exist in developing nations, i.e. India in this case, and then use that to create huge misrepresentation. No, thank you. We think that misrepresentation does exist. For example, in the case of India's Daughter of the BBC, they do not necessarily show the true size of India. They focus predominantly on defense lawyers, of patriarchy that exists within that society, of rape apologists, and the tone that they have. But thank you. They're used to show. The documentaries are used in a way to show that these are the stances that exist within India towards rape. I think that's something that's completely untrue. When you look at the fact that the progressive movement that's existed within India towards the rape and towards eradicating rape in society in the first place, firstly, you try and get women in schools. Secondly, when you also have movements to get toilets into rural houses so that they don't get raped when they go outside. But thirdly, when you also have an anti-rape stance being taken by its population, by the citizens as well, when the killing of rapists and so on has already happened. And we also support India's decision to ban the showing of these movies within the nation in itself. In that the nation has a progressive stance, but yet these are things that are not represented within the documentaries, are not actually stigmatized by these documentaries coming on. When you have a show showing different ideas or different stances taken by India that are going to be shown to a global public, we think that's really problematic. So what are these problems that are going to occur? I'm going to explain them from twofold. Firstly, on the international level of how international actors interact with India in the first place. We think that the first problem that you create is that these nations or these other actors interacting with India or representatives of India, Indians, for example, the diplomats, are going to assume firstly that there are differing ideas of women existing within that nation, within that country, to the ideals that you have from the Western nations. For example, on platforms like the UN or on platforms of international conferences, I think that these are going to be problematic because you twist the way they interact with these nations, and it also creates the mindset that these are people who are not willing to accept the fact that women have full rights as men. And that's something that becomes problematic. On a tangible level, this perception also decreases the will to help or will to send aid to these nations because they believe that they don't really, because they believe that these aid will not necessarily be efficient on a per capita basis. When you consider the fact that these documentaries are creating the perception that there is no traction or there is no progression on these issues, then you decrease the will for these foreign nations to try and help because they do not believe that it's something that can actually gain any more traction. We think that it's creating a situation where they would rather prefer to send money into other areas where they would see fit, where they would see it being better. But when you also consider the fact that foreign filmmakers are going to be considered as legitimate objects, as legitimate actors who are supposedly objective, we think that then becomes problematic. I'll take you in a minute. It becomes problematic when you have cases like the BBC, CNN, or Discovery Channel who are looking into these nations and creating that narrative from looking into these nations. The comparison is local actors and local TVs or local documentaries are going to be seen as propaganda, and that's something which we see as being problematic.
Okay, I would like to know what your team's stance is on rape culture. Do you agree that it is overwhelmingly predominant in India?
We see a progression towards the movement to change it, and that's something we support from our side of the house. We think that these documentaries are going completely against that. So going back to what I was saying, the local industries, if they was created, is rather going to be seen as propaganda, and there is no way to even have an effectual counter-narrative coming from those nations towards these global narratives that are being created by these foreign documentaries. It then acts as a silver bullet towards the narrative that exists, and therefore the foreign documentary and the images that it portrays becomes the truth within these nations. That's something we think has been problematic. But moreover, on a local level, the problems that we see are a couple. Firstly, when you consider the fact that these foreign media are far more accessible and far more popular within that nation in terms of news, cartoons, sports, and in any area, the perception that exists in India is going to be they don't necessarily doubt these foreign nations because they see them as being legitimate ideas, legitimate corporations. Therefore, it deters these people in the first place from participating in trying to be progressive within their nation because these are things, problems that can be shown as being so entrenched within society. Therefore, these people are not going to be thinking that these are problems that they can solve, but rather problems that are so entrenched that they cannot necessarily solve within society. They're rather going to be willing to believe that the governments are lying to them, and that's something that becomes problematic in terms of how the people view the nation and how people view the problem itself within that nation. For those reasons, we're very proud to propose this.
what India's daughter did for India was for the first time show unedited clips of an actual rapist. Something that either we as Indians never wanted to show or be shown to the international world, or filmmakers in our country never wanted to talk about because they thought it was too abrasive to local populations, because they thought this doesn't actually exist, Mrs. Speaker. We think rape culture is pervasive, and to say that it misrepresents the problem is a lie, because the problem actually exists, Mrs. Speaker, which hordes and hordes, millions and millions of men actually think that raping a woman is alright, or if a woman resists if she's being raped, then she is the victim, Mrs. Speaker. That's something that's actually a problem that filmmakers in India would never have talked about, with the kind of pressures that already exist and the ones that you compound now by putting them as self-censors who now want to moderate this content in the first place. I'll learn about it before I go on to my actual constructive. The first thing that Yuki said in his model was like, oh, you're going to involve multiple filmmakers, so there's diversity of opinion, right? I'll ask you one thing. If you're making a film about a country like India, which has 1.5 billion people, at what point do you stop and realize that, oh, you canvassed everyone's opinion, and now you realize that this is the point at which you want to make a film, and everyone's agreed to it. But secondly, what happens when large sections of society are actually opposed to the concept that you're talking about? So in instances with some representatives of filmmakers say that we actually think rape culture is good and you ought not criticize it, at what point do you say that, oh, we won't count you in because we oppose you, but like all the other filmmakers can then vote it in, right? But the third thing that we want to talk about is to what extent can these people actually be involved, right? You know, told us whether these local filmmakers have a veto on this content, or can actually tell these filmmakers what to do or not to do. That there was this like arbitrary description of what their role is. Like, please tell us exactly what the limit of their control is, because that actually proves the effectiveness of your policy. But lastly, Mr. Speaker, we think foreign filmmakers already have an incentive to involve local populations. Like the fact that the BBC actually involved and took the interviews of the rapist, his daughter, and the parents of the victim means that you're already canvassing local opinions. The fact that you're making a documentary about that film topic means that you're required by the definition of being a documentary, or the fact that you want to make a good film or make it realistic that you hire both consultants who are local experts or involve individuals who belong to that context to make a documentary a lot more realistic. First argument, why are these movies self-correcting, right? And why are the incentives for documentary makers not to be the kind Yuki talks about? Firstly, BBC documentaries aren't IMAX movies pandering to bold Australians, right? If you look at documentary movies, these are often targeted extremely intelligent people and are made by reputable organizations. So first thing that we say is the reputational risk of misrepresenting a complete country is massive for the BBC, whose future consumption of their movies by the like social intelligentsia, the left in Western countries is dependent on their accuracy and ability to be moderate. But secondly, who actually becomes a documentary filmmaker? In the instance that documentaries often don't give you any money and you dedicate your life to something that's low income, never gives you the glamour of making a film, it's likely that people who dedicate their lives to making documentaries want their accurate descriptions of what the problem actually is, because that's why they join becoming a documentary filmmaker in the first place. So there's a natural incentive to do this. But thirdly, given the fact that funding for documentaries in the future doesn't come from selling tickets at IMAX, Mr. Speaker, but it comes from critical think tanks who sponsor documentaries, or from critical awards which look at the content and balance of your film to fund films in the future, means that people who make these documentaries have natural incentives to not be abrasive, or have natural incentives not to have false representation or false facts in their movies. Firstly, let's look at the comparative, because in a world in which you actually want to engage rape culture, why do we think international filmmakers should do it alone, and why do local filmmakers actually add massive baggage which dilutes the message? Firstly, international filmmakers are super neutral third parties who are affected by the social pressures in that country. What do I mean? In a world in which you accept a large part of Indian men, irrespective of what they actually want to do, grow up in patriarchal societies which tell them from birth that they ought not to treat women as equals, and that's something that's ingrained in many of my friends who I see as patriarchs even though they didn't choose to be, because filmmakers in these countries aren't immune from those things. So it's far likely that people that you do engage in these societies, both statistically and literally, it's likely that these people are going to be people who harbor that culture or don't think that culture is something that you ought to oppose. In a world in which you give veto to these filmmakers, you have to dilute the ability for you to have an effective film that actually critiques this problem. But secondly, there are massive audience pressures, right? If you look at international media, the audience that they're pandering to are liberals within your country, as well as like liberal people outside your country, as opposed to like documentary filmmakers or large-scale filmmakers that you are going to contribute, like collaborate with. In these instances, you collaborate with large-scale filmmakers in India to get the scale that you want. Have you ever watched an Indian film? Like they have the most sexual stereotypes that you can ever exist. Like they're super sexist. These people are far less likely to ever say something that pisses off their audiences in the future, right? It's very unlikely that a large-scale filmmaker in India is actually going to challenge sexual stereotypes, given the fact that the local comedy dominator is going to watch this film in the future is going to feel like super annoyed that the fact that this guy is insulting him. So if you're actually going to interact with someone who's a large-scale filmmaker, he's never going to critique something that's inherent in that country, either in him or in his audiences. But even if you're actually going to talk about like independent filmmakers in India, they still have to face the social consequences of making such a film. E.g., their office is being attacked or their lives being put under threat. Something international media can isolate themselves from the pressure that you ought not be able to feel. Because if you've ever actually been to India, you would know that Salman Rushdie is banned, that people have been killed for saying things that people think are offensive to them. So I don't think make people should live under that pressure and make movies under that pressure. Thirdly, there are massive government pressures, Mr. Speaker, because if you look at developing countries, they clamp down on anything that they see as an attack on their country. Why international media far better? Because international individuals are protected by foreign governments from things like criminalization or massive fines on them. But secondly, there are channels outside the control of these countries to propagate their message. Compare that to domestic filmmakers who now you place in a position of being censors, right? Because at the point at which you place these people in these filmmakers, there's an inherent pressure on them to moderate these films, because that's the reason you're putting them there in the first place, right? There's a massive already existing barrier for these people to actually make films which offend the government. Why? Because there can be bans on these people and the economic livelihoods in other films in the future, even if they are completely unrelated to the film that they're making now, will be put at risk. Like if you're an Indian filmmaker, you can be banned by the government, you can be put in jail, you have a massive pressure to try and moderate the kind of content of these films that you're not engaging in. But the fact that the government puts you in a position specifically for the purpose of moderation means that you're far more likely to overcorrect and you'll dilute the message of these films. The conclusion of this argument being that you severely dilute the message of these films and actually are left fundamentally incapable of actually ever critiquing something that is societally pervasive, something that governments have mistaken and will only seen bad as go.
India admits that rape is a problem and yet implemented numerous policies to correct the rape culture. The question is it better or worse for the change to happen to misrepresent India as a country that condones the rape culture? I
actually disagree that large-scale rural populations in India have been convinced that rape is a problem. Even if you look at Delhi, for example, rape rates are still the highest in an urbanized country like Delhi, which you consider to be educated. But if you look at large rural populations, there's been absolutely no movement to try and correct for rape, or a large-scale cultural movement to actually try and say that rape is bad. So I actually reject the notion that India has actually prospered into an anti-rape culture where rapes don't actually happen. Lastly, how does it affect discourse, Mr. Speaker? Because we think international media are the only one who can spur on the civic society in these domestic countries to action. Because often civic society can actually make decisions, or the intelligentsia in your country can actually affect politics. Never actually see these issues in the instance that local filmmakers are too afraid to produce these things. So the BBC is actually spurred on women's rights groups, like women's rights groups, rape activists, for example, and large-scale middle-class Indians have actually supported and trashed the government for their ban. So that it just shows that people want to be involved in these things, but can never be because they never actually see the real issues, because filmmakers in that country are too afraid to talk about these things, Mr. Speaker. They're too afraid. You might be not afraid to discuss why rape is bad, but you're too afraid to discuss and admit that you may be someone who's a victim of the rape culture, or you may be someone who also thinks certain way subconsciously. We think international filmmakers are in the best position to have neutral and content-heavy things, content-heavy films which actually critique policies and cultures. The local filmmakers who have the incentive to self-correct. I'm exceptionally proud to oppose.
It's easy for them to stand up here and be idealistic about the world of documentaries and suggest that things are fine in them. Here's the reality. Documentaries are not always factual. They often misrepresent the truth. They often tend to choose the parts that get to sell the best parts of their story by picking the part of the truth that best sells. We think that those kinds of things need to be stopped, and we need to be allowing of local representation and local views on the opinion to be clear. That is why we don't allow foreign filmmakers to have free reign to decide everything that goes into the documentary. We think that they must have some local input on how the creation of the documentary comes about and have local input on the investment of what happens. Yes, rape culture is overwhelming in India, but it is not representative of the country's stance on rape. It is not representative of what happens on the issue of rape culture in India. Huge progress has been made on this issue that should also be involved in the showing of the discourse of rape. So if you're making a documentary about rape in India, you cannot just talk about rape culture being overwhelming and forget to talk about the fact that progress is being made in different parts of the country. That's how you make it factual. That's how you make it representative. And it's unfair for a documentary to only show one portion of it. Let's look into policy, and this is the random quibble Mitra had, right? That you didn't specify how much time each particular producer has for each particular kind of thing. Look, documentary making 101, guys. It's not fictional film. You cannot create a plot around it. It's not about your own vision about it. It's about multiple producers that plan different parts of the documentary and connect the thread through a common line. Within that, you ensure that you have different senses of what the different views or different angles of what the reality on the ground is. It has nothing to do with your own careers of fantasy ideas of what a plot should be. The argument on the side that there is some natural incentive that stops individuals from being involved makes absolutely no sense. Sure, realistic and sure, idealistically, there should be some natural incentive to be self-correcting, but the fact that there is legitimacy behind the very name of these individuals suggests that these individuals don't have to be that correcting of what they produce because they have the reputation of the big label or the foreign film house label on them. The reason why locals don't disparage things as much is because they think it's BBC, it's CNN, it's this huge foreign person looking from outside in, so obviously they must have a better picture of it than we do because we don't understand the full picture from where we are. We think that's the kind of reputation and legitimacy that comes from being a foreign filmmaker and foreign film house that just doesn't allow for these individuals to be naturally self-correcting as Aditya wanted to make it. But then there is this strange idea that we now force local filmmakers to be some sort of censors in this matter. No, look, the point is to get individuals to show their own opinions or sides of the story that exist. We're not asking individuals to show points of views that they obviously don't believe in or that they obviously don't think exist in the country. They're showing parts of the story that they agree with or that they think exist at that point in time. It's strange for him to come up and say that on one hand, red culture is simply to the point that it's true and sexist and majority of India believes in it. On the other hand, many filmmakers don't want to prove pro-red culture arguments because it goes against the very nature of India. That's contradictory, Mr. Speaker. If majority of the country is pro-rape and pro-red culture and it's overwhelming, then you should have no problem finding an individual or domestic filmmaker who's interested in being pro-rape culture and wanting to show that part of the story as well. So no, we don't think it actually affects the kind of documentaries that you create on that side. Before we talk about why we think it's better to create a trend in general, whether of being more inquisitive of misrepresentations that do exist in documentaries, both in India and outside of India, because this debate is also about more than India.
If you can pick the filmmakers you want to choose to work with, and all they can do is give opinions, wouldn't the BBC just pick 5 filmmakers who agree with them and then make a movie anyway?
Yeah, that was a policy where we said you have to show multiple views, more than a single view of what the situation on the ground is. So, have more than one opinion that's different from one another, policy guys. Going into what exactly we think it comes down to when it comes to creating a trend of ensuring that misrepresentation doesn't happen. There's a growing trend of documentaries, ladies and gentlemen, of misconstruing facts in order to gain an audience. And the biggest example of this was the Big Mac documentary that existed, right? That somehow you could eat McDonald's for 12 days and nothing happens to you, and there is no actual impact on you, which has been proven to be false scientifically, that you actually would have some consequences on you if you did that. We think no one questions those kinds of documentaries for 2 reasons, right? One, because a documentary is supposed to be factual, so why would you lie in a documentary? It's not a documentary anymore, or it's the opinion of everyone else. Or 2, because you are someone who has previously created some other documentary that was really famous or really strong. In the case of the Big Mac documentary, the director was the same guy that directed the Columbine shootings documentary, and therefore he had a reputation behind him of being legitimate and therefore always telling the truth. We think in these scenarios, there is no reason to actually question the misrepresentations that are existing. People within the system cannot change that reputation or perception that's created by it. Yuki told you extensively why that perception is bad. It changes the way you create relations with other people. It changes the way you interact on a larger international scene. It changes the way you actually create change on the local ground. We think that all of these things are affected by perceptions that you have no ability to change because you have no legitimacy or power that's as huge as BBC or that's as huge as CNN. We think that these are the kinds of things that you want to create questions about, you want people to think about, and you want people to be involved in the discussion. What this policy does onside government is it makes filmmakers more acutely aware of representation, having to adhere to local collaborators' interests, and ensuring that local collaborators have an opinion on a particular issue, and that opinion is involved in the final product. But that means it's good for the future of the industry of documentaries, and ensuring that the right facts are out there there all the time. But secondly, it makes the audience more acutely aware of what they're being fed as well. Because advertising being representative and credible is insufficient, and now you force them to show that they actually are being representative and credible by showing multiple opinions in the documentary instead of just one. Sure, there are some documentaries out there that are fantastic right now, that are showing off the multiple opinions, that are self-correcting because critical think tanks are paying them for it, or because they are wonderfully balanced. The problem is that there are a large number of documentaries that aren't, that actually tell lies to public. And we think that these individuals have no way of correcting their reputation or correcting the perception put upon them because of these documentaries. The good policy outcomes from government ensure that we correct these bad hats that do exist in status quo, that they do nothing about on that side because they don't want to involve themselves in the process. At the end of the day, government ensures that you actually get the facts of a particular scenario out there, but more importantly, you allow the individual that's involved in the process to correct their reputation or correct their perception on the matter so that their voice is more fairly heard. We're proud to propose.
Now.
All opinions, all views are not created equal. In a world in which canvassing a diversity of opinions means allowing a forum for people who do not accept rape culture to speak and to advocate against moves to resolve those problems, we reject that that is a benefit. And literally, let me quote a part of Viha's speech for you, when she said, given the situation in India, it ought to be easy to find people who are pro-rape culture or who disagree that it's sufficiently bad, that those views can be reflected in a documentary. Why would any documentarian whose aim in creating a documentary is to expose a hugely problematic part of society and attempt to resolve that, willingly ever create a documentary that was also canvassing opinions that said rape culture really isn't that bad, guys? We're actually doing enough, or we ought not do anything at all. I think that's a really significant issue for them. A diversity of opinion does not always mean good things, especially in a world in which you've accepted and acknowledged that rape culture is overwhelmingly pervasive in a country like India. At that stage, we think, if anything, over-critique is necessary. The second thing I want to do is actually talk about the content of the documentary. I wonder if anybody on the government team has seen it, because the suggestion that it is misrepresentative of India is problematic. Let me tell you a couple of things about what it actually featured. Unedited statements of a person who is convicted of rape, unedited statements of the person who defended them in court, and statements of the people associated with the trial and the victims' families. At no point do the documentarians provide commentary on those things, make a suggestion that every single Indian person is a rapist, make a suggestion that the Indian government has not done anything to progress away from rape culture. What it does is, in an incredibly important way that shocks people and gets people to talk about or think about these issues, confront the average Indian person. Because actually, we think, Mr. Speaker, the average intellectual, intelligent, caring Indian person is not a rapist. The problem is, under the status quo, that these views are hidden. There's a presumption that because I don't hold these views, when they are represented, must not be accurate. That's precisely the reason the documentarian offered these views in the stark way that they did, and we think that is incredibly important for energizing people to care about these issues. The second thing I want to question is the concept of progress. They say on their side, this documentary is unfair because by implication, right, it doesn't actually criticize the government, but by implication it suggests the government hasn't done sufficient work to progress away from rape culture. Good. We hope that's the implication. Let me tell you why. Because we reject my outrage at the suggestion that the Indian government has been insufficiently good at dealing with rape culture. 3 weeks ago, prominent BJP minister came up and said, if women are out at night, that is legitimate grounds on which they can be raped. That person is an elected official in Indian Parliament. Recently, there was a challenge to the court to overturn a lack of conviction on a marital rape. And the court came out resoundingly and said, marital rape does not exist. The suggestion that India, as a result of these rapes, has moved towards huge progressivism is like a genuine lie on your side of the house. So you need to engage in a world where the kinds of people you're likely to engage in this documentary are people who either, A, live in that society and therefore hold the views that we are trying to correct, or even if we're being more generous to you, live in that society, agree that those views are wrong and want to resolve them, but are afraid to be the ones who say that. And here's where Viha goes wrong in her speech. She never engages with the nuance in this debate. We don't think every filmmaker in India is a rapist or advocates rape culture. We do think every filmmaker in India is afraid of the ramifications, the physical threat might be posed to their studio, to their family, or people who do endorse rape culture, something which does not operate on the kinds of people who make these documentaries. Let me ask a third question. To what extent do these people have an impact on the content, right? Because Viha gets up and says, oh, well, the model, guys, it's just a model, so let's not talk about it, right? The reason it's important is because either these local people, these local producers or filmmakers, or whoever the hell these people are capable of vetoing content, are capable of meaningfully changing the narration of the story, or they're not. Viha's suggestion is we could just interview a lot of different people with no real aim in mind, and they can be connected by a thread. The thread being what? That it all happens in one documentary. The aim of the documentary is to point out how bad rape culture is. How on earth do you construct that narrative at the same time, giving equal airtime to people who think rape is a legitimate thing to do, Viha? I genuinely don't understand. Because your argument at the end of the debate wasn't about having local people represented. It was about a diversity of opinion. It was about having every opinion challenged by the counter opinion. The counter opinion is illegitimate. It is endorsing rape culture. We don't think that should have the same level of airtime. We think that's incredibly problematic. So at no point in this debate will there actually comparative of the things that would prevent locals from making these critiques. The third or fourth, or whatever number I'm up to, question I want to ask. Are people genuinely offended by the content that's produced in this film? Yeah, let me tell you who they are. They're people who endorse rape culture. For those people, this film is incredibly confronting, right? Because it's led to huge international critique of that opinion. It's led to huge, it's led to huge scrutiny on the issue. The overwhelming majority of women's rights groups in India, groups that are attempting to achieve progress, as this team wanted, came out resoundingly in favour of this documentary, have critiqued the government's ban on this documentary, want every single school child in every single region in India to be forced to watch this documentary, to recognise that these views actually exist. So the suggestion that there's this overwhelming backlash amongst the people who are trying to achieve progress is completely inaccurate. People who hate rape culture as much as we do, who live in India, are thankful for the existence of this documentary. They know the local people cannot come out and say these things in the way that international people can do, and they are thankful. They want people to be forced to watch and confront these things. So the only people who are offended or who backlash against this documentary are people who endorse rape culture. We think, if anything, the people on the fringe, the people who don't necessarily recognise how bad rape culture is, the people who aren't actively trying to change laws to fix the problems with rape culture. Those are the people we care about in this debate. We don't think those people are offended. We don't think those people become more likely to be a rapist as a result of the existence of this documentary. We think those people are finally confronted with the commonality of this opinion and are energised to actually do something to resolve it. We think we're the team that gets progress in this debate. But let's assume for a second that we don't. Let's assume for a second that domestic audiences don't react the way that we said they do. We think this has been an incredibly important thing for highlighting this issue to the international community. We think there is huge international pressure now on the Indian government to be more receptive to the women's rights groups who are trying to advocate for changes in the law, who are trying to prevent marital rape, who care about the fact that the government doesn't have enough police on the street to actually stop and intervene when a woman is being raped. In a world in which we cannot influence domestic populations, in a world in which rape culture is so endemic, we think we need scrutiny from the outside. That's exactly what this documentary did. We're incredibly proud of this documentary, and we're incredibly proud to oppose. We heard a lot of convenient theories about how foreign filmmakers behave with respect to producing documentaries. The incentive to be truthful, to be fair, to be balanced because they're sponsors, awards, etc. But we think those incentives only work in an idealistic world, which we are obviously not in, because we've factually proven to you that incentives are obviously failing. Famous documentaries, award-winning documentaries, premiere false premises that misrepresent progresses of certain things. The Big Mac documentary obviously misrepresented scientific fact to the point where people think McDonald's is not harmful for your health because it was sponsored by Big Mac to promote those kinds of content. Things such as female genital mutilation is extremely prevalent in Africa when the point of the status quo was that they were banned by a lot of African nations and were only prevalent in small villages. We told you there isn't a natural incentive. Because in a world where multiple incentives are opposing each other, time and time again, these foreign filmmakers have proven themselves to only prioritize profit making. Sensationalizing these local issues means they have more market, a bigger audience, and a bigger selling point. We cannot trust them with responsible journalism, which is that misrepresents the progress, or even just removes the ability for these nations to represent themselves within how these conversations about their own issues are happening. We believe even if there are no benefits, but there are massive benefits, they at least have a right to represent themselves in a global platform, especially when Yuki told you and we agreed. Local producers don't have the audience or incentive to produce it, and once it goes out in a global market, with the credibility of BBC and CNN, they don't have a counter-narrative to provide because no rebuttal is good enough. Your government is perceived as lying. You don't have the local market. They completely lose their ability to politically represent the stance of their nation and what progress we're at in regards to addressing those issues. They never wanted to bother to even engage with those harms that came from the first speaker's speech. Before I go on to more questions, let's do away with Gemma's accusation on the documentary, because she said that filmmakers, they don't plant messages merely because this is unedited footage of a lot of people. No, you can plant footage that fits into the narrative that you're trying to sell. They put disproportionate focus on a defense lawyer who's trying to get money out of defending this rape person. Of course he's a rape apologist, and featured the rapist, Mr. Speaker. They didn't feature a lot of items on the victims, on the women's rights movement, on the prosecution, who all fought against it, or even a representative from the Indian government saying that we are trying our very best to address this issue. You have premised the Indian government as one that is overwhelmingly impugned with rape culture, but a government that doesn't care about progress. That how global actors interacted with them in terms of improving women's rights status in those countries, and that how the local individuals within those countries to take action against it, because we're further down the rabbit hole. This is not a problem that we can solve in our generation, and that's why you created apathy in terms of not solving the problem. All of those things, Mr. Speaker, not rebutted in this debate. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, can the policy work? Secondly, are there more harms than good? Can the policy work? Take a seat. Because we had constant accusations that the model doesn't work. Let's address all of the issues that they had. Firstly, they said that local producers are biased anyways because rape culture is prevalent. Again, Mr. Speaker, there is a natural incentive, at least an incentive versus zero incentive on the foreign filmmaker to represent their nation in the best light possible, because disparaging your nation is disparaging your nationality. But when we talk about representation, Mr. Speaker, you're talking about rape culture that's prevalent in the uneducated and in rural areas. If you're talking about an established local production company with the most amount of credibility, this is likely to be on a balance of probabilities. Educated individuals who likely agree with the stance of governments in terms of trying to fix the rape culture. But then more often than not, we at least better the odds of collaboration. But here's the problem that they didn't want to address. Because if these people have a certain view, and when foreign filmmakers have polarizing views, they have to meet in the middle. We add another actor that they actually have to speak with and consider with throughout the production of the entire movie. At least there is an additional system of check and balance. Let's compare it with yours. Well, there's absolutely none. We think there's a far worse representation. So let's look at the second level. They said that diversity is a bunch of bull. We don't even have to do it. Let's be clear. The only reason we even mention the word diversity is to achieve representation of what the nation wants, not to have diversity per se. So we think representation is the aim. Even when the model fails, a lot of legislation don't put out models, Mr. Speaker, they put out aims of the law. So when a documentary breaches the law by not being representative of the nation, we told you in Yuki's speech, we can bring the case to court. But sue India's daughter for not representing the actual stance of the Indian government within this issue, not being represented within that political conversation. We provide that avenue of legal redressal. You shut them down because there's no other counter-narrative that is powerful enough to rebut the documentaries that is legitimized and provided by the BBC. We told you again in Yuki's speech, BBC and CNN will have an infinite amount of legitimacy because they are the foreign outsiders looking in. We don't supposedly
interest. We are the ones with human rights within our countries. There's local individuals who are part of that progress who think that the government is lying when these things are happening and more likely to step back towards this progress because this government is so far down the rabbit hole. Second question, will this do Mohammed before that?
A Bangladeshi author was recently burned down for expressing his atheistic views. There's a majority of Bangladeshi people wrong. Which Bangladeshi filmmaker in the future has ever endorsed a neutral film which critiques religion in its films?
That is my first harm on Adil Mohammed. They say that local producers will never publish the documentaries because they're afraid. We think, again, this is a convenient false misrepresentation. What just happened in India? A mob lynch happened that dragged a rapist out of prison and lynched him. We're not saying this is a good thing, but this is representative of where we are in terms of India's progression. We are so anti-rape right now because of India's progression to the point where we're willing to dole out punishment. We really think the judiciary is wrong in not punishing a particular rapist. We think India is making progress. When they say that people who watch these videos are only outraged when they are part of the rape culture, we say that's wrong. People who are outraged are people who are part of that progress and being represented in a global platform that they have done absolutely nothing. Here's the real harm of this debate, Mr. Speaker. On a global platform, India is being misrepresented as a country who does not care about the rape culture. And we agree with Gemma. We never said that India has done enough. In fact, not even enough. India has not done close to enough. But the thing is, India is so acutely aware of this. They are seeing this themselves. They're seeing we're not doing enough. That's why they're trying to fix these policies. They recognize in rural areas, because of the prevalence of rape and it's hard to change it, they put toilets in women's homes so that they don't have to go out, Mr. Speaker, because when people go out of their homes, they're more likely to be raped. We are doing all we can, but to be misrepresented as a political platform that we are a country who doesn't care, it reverses movements. That means when an international aid organization that is trying to follow the women's rights movement look at a lost cause that is India, because that's how we're being misrepresented on a global platform, saying that I'm not going to get returns for the investment that I put per capita because I don't get the kind of rights progression because your country is so far down the rabbit hole. Individuals within India will look at this and say that there's no use in participating in this political change because look at these individuals who are apparently prevalent. They're not prevalent. They're being misrepresented as being the only individuals in India and that they are the only opinions that happen. That's what happened in India's daughter. That's what happened in many other documentaries. This is not just a single problem. This is a prevailing problem with all foreign filmmakers who misrepresent for the sake of money. It's not that hard to produce the same documentary with a counter-narrative collaborating with the local producer. The harms are minuscule. We are addressing a better political conversation that's more inclusive. Proud to propose.
It's strange that government brings up the Big Mac documentary because funnily enough, in response to that very biased and terrible documentary in society, ladies and gentlemen, we had Super Size Me, which exposed every lie in McDonald's documentary about their own Big Mac. And guess what that resulted in? That resulted in salads in McDonald's and also banning the supersizer Coke in McDonald's all across the world. The fact is, government doesn't live in a world of reality, ladies and gentlemen, where there is a unitary view of the international community that is against India, that apparently there isn't a multitude of views in society that can critique one bad documentary in these circumstances, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we think, guys. You guys need to live in reality. So first, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the easiest question for us to answer in this debate. Are documentaries always representative of the truth? Because I think we were very willing to concede under this side of the house that of course documentaries have their shortfalls in terms of what might limit their objective value. We can see that they may have some degree of profit motive or some degree of maintaining some viewership. But we gave you loads of analysis under the side of opposition unresponded to by my, contrary to her shouting. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, is in regards to the viewership target, no response there. The fact that you target the middle class intelligentsia of the international community means that you're targeting a community that is generally more critical and more scrutinizing than the average reasonable bogan in Australia, ladies and gentlemen. That you don't just internalize and swallow all the information you get and have no critical capacity whatsoever in these circumstances. The fact that we today discuss how bad the Big Mac documentary is goes to show that people don't just swallow documentaries wholesale and actually can say that if you have a not critical, bad documentary which is misrepresentative of a country, I can actually identify that as an average reasonable person. Secondly, it's in regards to regard to funding and whether or not we're actually beholden to people viewing it. The fact is, most documentaries don't even rely on viewership and the revenue that you get on publicizing it. You get money from anthropological foundations or research facilities, ladies and gentlemen, and give you grants in order to research it. Most people dedicate decades in order to produce one particular documentary, and even one false mistake means that a documentarian's career is dead. That means there is an overwhelming amount of reputational risk for an individual to lie or have overly convenient representations of the truth. There was absolutely no response under the sub-government in regards to that mitigation on that side of the house. The last thing that we told you about is there seems to be an underlying assumption under that side of that there is a singular international opinion that is imposed upon India in these circumstances. Unfortunately, that's not how reality works, guys. The fact is that when you have bad documentaries that are unrepresentative of the truth, even the industry of itself, by nature, is critical of their peers and have self-correcting mechanisms. Aditya spent a whole lot of time in his speech talking about how peer-to-peer review within the documentary industry, ladies and gentlemen, funnels in a certain degree of critique when it comes to whether or not your truth is actually representative of the context that we're talking about. Even in the worst case scenario on the outside of the house, where let's say India doesn't have the financial capacity or the commercial capacity in order to reply to, say, BBC in these circumstances. This is how you respond, guys. If you don't have the ability to respond in those circumstances, even then you can still rely on industries within the people within those industries to be critical under those circumstances. But we on face factually disagree that India cannot disprove that those facts are real to begin with. What's so difficult of India putting out a statement or putting out their own documentary in these circumstances to be able to disclaim that in these circumstances these facts are true and I'm putting out my facts on it and this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. At the conclusion of this issue, ladies and gentlemen, obviously, there isn't a unitary view in regards to how countries are represented. There are fairly enough checks and balances to ensure there is a balanced representation of these individuals, and we don't think that there's any sort of reason why these international documentarians aren't able to do the job sufficiently well. Yes.
Clearly, your middle-class intelligentsia audience is again a theory that doesn't work in reality because no one has defended India's motivation, policies, and progress. And if they want to choose a counter-narrative, we told them again there's no legitimacy, they're being told that they're lying.
Okay, so here's how we're going to talk about the second issue, right? Whether or not there is a value to be said whenever you talk about what India has been doing, whether or not they've been balanced, whether or not they've been making progress in this instance. The thing is, ladies and gentlemen, we work in a context where oftentimes the problems are greatly under talked about in these circumstances. In most circumstances, we're willing to say that we're willing to exaggerate problems rather than not talk about them even more. The fact is, the rape culture that you're talking about and whatever India is doing is unfortunately extremely underwhelming. The fact that people, whenever they watch these documentaries, and the first assumption they make is that rape culture exists, is because whatever India is doing obviously doesn't come to mind first to think that it is enough to defeat rape culture in these circumstances, ladies and gentlemen. The fact is, rape culture is still excessively prevalent, and that is the problem that people are faced with. Now, you have to tell me under that side of the house, why is it that they educate, under that side, they told us that local collaborators will be educated and therefore will be balanced and won't corrupt the situation. We give you many levels of analysis to that. Firstly, we just don't think it's true that individuals, that local collaborators in India will have no interest whatsoever. I think Aditya spent a significant portion in his speech saying why there are real-world commercial incentives for local collaborators to not represent the truth, considering that, number one, their lives are in danger, considering atheists and people who sympathize with atheists in Bangladesh get dragged through the streets and get lynched. The fact that their professional incentives oftentimes, no, you didn't respond. The professional incentives don't get affected, ladies and gentlemen, because their movies and the people that view in their own country will not want to watch their movies anymore. Aditya talked about this. And then thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, if you truly think that these people are educated and have absolutely no substantive difference in regards to their opinions about rape culture, then what's the substantive difference about having them or not having them there anyway, ladies and gentlemen? And we think that's exceptionally important to realize that a government provided us no response in regards to the much of the realities that local collaborators face that limits the ability to be intellectually objective and free in these circumstances. Unfortunately, government in this debate only provided several harms, whether it be apathy, whether it be locals not caring. But unfortunately, that's illogical. What right-minded person watches a documentary about people getting raped and just not care about it? Unfortunately, reality shows that when this documentary came out about women getting raped, ladies and gentlemen, there was massive outrage, massive clash, and people do care about it at the end of the day. Unfortunately, guys, we live in reality, side of opposition.
Okay. India's daughter was met with overwhelming celebration from those within India who are striving for the progress that the government team wants. From victims of rape, including the family of this, in fact, victim, from women's rights groups, and from advocacy groups that have spent the past many decades lobbying the Indian government to actually make progress or to actually make policies that protect women from abuse. The people who didn't like the release of India's daughter were the Indian government. And no wonder, we accepted in this debate that it was critical of the Indian government by implication, by suggesting that rape culture is prevalent. Of course, you imply that a government has done an insufficient amount. In a world in which the government team in this debate accepted, according to that the progress has been so minimal, so overwhelmingly minimal, we were okay with that critique happening in the way it did. I'm going to do two things in this reply. First of all, I'm going to give you a comparative of the incentives of the various filmmakers and tell you why we win that clash. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why this leads to the progress that team wanted. Maya accused us of living in an idealistic world. She said, oh, it's just fabricated that these people care about their integrity, they care about the scrutiny that's offered, that they care about the awards. That's all fabricated. So these people are money hungry, they care about people watching these documentaries, and therefore they will sensationalize. Never really engaging with why sensationalism would be appealing to the people whom they are trying to sell these documentaries to. So to the extent that profitability was an issue, I wasn't exactly sure why it would be true that the people, e.g. largely middle class people who are high school or university educated, would be more likely to watch these documentaries in the first place. I wasn't really sure about that. But let's balance it out. We're willing to accept that some of those things might be true. But they weren't generous enough to accept the same for Indian filmmakers. Because they said, no, of course they'll be balanced. Of course the opinions they'll provide will be legitimate. So let us tell you some of the opposite things that I think are probably a bit more credible, right? That A, people who you're going to collaborate with are more likely to endorse rape culture, not necessarily because they're bad people, because they grow up in a society that tells them those things are legitimate. They're afraid for their own physical security, as we named on a number of occasions, even in a generous world in which these people wholeheartedly agree with the message of the film. Or finally, they're afraid of the implication of critiquing a government who they have to live under, who makes decisions about whether or not their films can be released in the future, who makes decisions about whether or not those films will be funded in the future. We give you the example of Salman Rushdie. So at best, in this debate, those things kind of come out in the wash, right? Westerners or international people have a certain type of incentives that are not good, so do locals. So why would we prefer that we over-criticize rather than under-criticize? Because this is what they need to engage with. We're willing to accept perhaps the implication of this film is to blow up rape culture. But in a world in which for decades, in fact hundreds of years, we have ignored rape culture and done nothing about it, we think the outcome of over-criticizing is better than a continuation of a world in which we choose not to criticize or not to accept the significance of those things. Which leads to the second question. Because the context of this debate is a world in which both teams would like less rape to occur. Let's talk about that. We think what this does is two things. First of all, it forces international communities who might not know about the issues to get angry and pressure their governments to use whatever diplomatic leverage they have to pressure the Indian government to actually do the things they are A, unwilling to do under the status quo, and B, despite local populations have been unwilling to do in the past few years as acknowledged by the government team. But B, they lead domestically to individuals who are on the margins who themselves may not be rapists, but who don't care enough to actively strive for progress to change their opinions, because these documentaries are shocking. They would prefer a documentary that said this: rape is bad, the Indian government has done some things, it hasn't done other things, perhaps we should think about what the best things are. But at no point did they actually explain why that documentary would have any impact in a body in which people are predisposed to want to maintain the status quo and to not be criticised. We were very happy if the worst case scenario for our side was to be overcritical of a country that has done a despicable job of protecting women from rape.
The dichotomy in this debate is not discourse or none. It is balanced discourse or one-sided discourse. And we tell you on this side that we want to ensure that discourse happens, but that both sides of the discourse are fairly represented in a documentary. So the better or the ideal version of India's daughter would have still had the unedited footage of the defense counsel and the unedited footage of the rapist and the unedited footage of the rape apologists, but at the same time still had a segment that told us these were the progresses India had made in the last 10 years or the last 15 years. So all of the discourse that they wanted to create to ensure progress ensured on that side still happened on our side because we were able to show both sides of the picture, ensuring the same standards of progress and discourse that they wanted to. But even if that was not the case, we think the end goal of this policy never was to find a way to guarantee progress, right? That was a misrepresentation that happened on opposition. From Yuki onwards, the end goal was always to ensure local representation in the creation of a documentary that ensured their own views were portrayed in a video about them. That they had the voice or the ability to ensure that their opinions on an issue were heard. And it wasn't just a foreign random person turning up and saying, this is what you think of because this is a movie I want to make. We think that's why local representation was important, to ensure that a comprehensive picture of the truth existed because a local person was involved in the project. The policy has always been about having local producers who are always invested in the documentary so that they're involved in the building of the narrative of the documentary. So this entire misrep in both of Gemma's speeches about interviewees being involved made absolutely no sense because that's status quo. What we wanted were producers being involved in the process of building that narrative. Because all documentaries build a narrative, guys. It's not just unedited footage laid out for individuals to watch. That's why the India's Daughter documentary picked and choose the parts of the interview, parts of the trial to choose to interview. They only interviewed the defense counsel and the rapist and didn't interview the prosecution or the victim. We think that kind of representation is harmful for what kind of picture you send to the people. The outcomes of the documentary showing just one opinion and not a single second of acknowledgement of a different opinion, maybe even existing in that country, is problematic because that's the perception that you send at the end of the day. It becomes the perception of the country. We think that means it affects not just that issue because it's fine and dandy for them to come up and say, well, maybe it solves the issue of rape in the country somehow. But we think that what happens is that it affects a lot of other issues on the ground as well. It affects a lot of the perception that India has on the ground. We told you this in UK when we told you that it hurts things like business or tourism when people are just afraid of India or boycott India and are afraid of involving themselves in that. We think you cannot balance yourselves against this and we don't think it's possible. The new method dumping myth, right, of the issues of being able to balance all of these things. Myth wanted to give you this random example of Supersize Me. Yes, hi guys, foreign film house versus another foreign film house that balances against one another. Great, but the Indian government isn't the same, right? The Indian government statement just doesn't have the same reach, access, or legitimacy because obviously they're seen as covering their asses when they put out a statement like that. We think that those kinds of things just don't have the ability to have the same counter narrative or rebuttal to the things that happen in the documentary. We think that's problematic when you force just one opinion on an issue down the throats of a global audience of your middle class intelligentsia and force them to believe in that one statement or compel them to believe in that one perception of India and have no ability to reach out to that exact same middle class intelligentsia and show them that that that's not the complete picture, here's the other part of the discourse as well. Because they want to argue that the locals have better discourse. Sure, but if their argument was that the global audience needs to be involved in the actual progress of this issue, then we think the global audience needs to have a balanced picture of what happens and sees what happens on both sides. They don't achieve that on that side. We achieve it far better. We're proud to propose.
Let's read out.
You forgot Japanese.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure about that one right there.
Thank you.